Hello, welcome to Government. This is Unit 9, Part 1, and this unit we are looking at civil rights. We just finished civil liberties. Not a lot of difference between the two, but it's more of a what you're looking at. Okay. Beginnings for civil rights. All right, starts with abolition. That means the abolition of slavery, so you're back into the 1800s, and women's rights. And by women's rights, the original meant women's suffrage, getting the right to vote. Well, in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was established. It's your first abolitionist movement, abolitionist group, and the start of your civil rights. All right. In 1848, there was a major women's rights convention held at Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss women's rights in general, but the focus was again on suffrage. Although at this point in time, there were a lot of states where women couldn't own property. Okay, and so that was a discussion as well. 1857, the Dred Scott decision, the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, was heard by the Supreme Court. This is the first major civil rights case to be heard by the Supreme Court. Didn't go the way civil rights groups wanted, but it was a civil rights case. Right. And the Civil War Amendment. So after the Civil War, you see a big change, of course, because the abolitionist movement, what it was working for, achieved its goal. The 13th Amendment was passed, and it bans all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude. Southern states, as they are readmitted to the Union, they responded with what are now known as the Black Codes, where they passed laws restricting the movement of the former slaves. All right. Eventually, the Black Codes develop into what we call the Jim Crow laws. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The idea was to invalidate some of the Black Codes. However, eventually that would be overturned in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would say that Congress did not have the right to do that. All right. Eventually, the 14th Amendment was passed within a couple of years, within a year or two of the Civil War. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to all the freed slaves. The Dred Scott decision had said that the slaves weren't citizens. All right, so the 14th Amendment made the former slaves citizens. Then it barred states from abridging this part of it. This is out of the amendment. The privileges or immunities of citizenship. All right, so in other words, you can't do anything. You have to guarantee their citizenship, all the privileges and all the rights that any citizen would have. All right, and they were not to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And then it also contains an equal protection clause. All right, so the 14th Amendment is a big piece of big change to the Constitution, and it was meant to basically assure that the freed slaves, and really everyone, all men, would have the same rights. All right. The 15th Amendment then was passed and guarantees the right of citizens to vote regardless of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, it allowed the former slaves to vote. All right. Women's groups, however, opposed it because it did not guarantee the right to vote to women, only to the former slaves that were male. Okay, so that was a big sticking point in women's rights groups. They wanted it rewritten to include women. Civil Rights, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Well, okay, so the Civil Rights Act of 1875, passed by Congress, it was designed to grant equal access to public accommodations. Because of the Black Codes and now the developing Jim Crow laws, public accommodations, like a hotel, they were discriminating. All right, based on race. And so the idea behind this Civil Rights Act was to end that. All right. However, 1877, Reconstruction ended. All right, Reconstruction was the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. The last Union troops were pulled out of the South, and a lot of Southerners that had supported the Confederacy were then able to get into office. There's a big change in Southern governments, the last of the Southern governments, and that's when the Jim Crow laws really start to show up. All right. Then in 1883, the Supreme Court basically overturned the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, saying that Congress could only prohibit state or federal action, right? And since the Jim Crow laws were local, they couldn't prohibit them. And then basically, the Supreme Court was saying that you couldn't tell the owner of a hotel who he had to take on as a customer. All right. And so then you end up things like this. This comes along later, but eventually even drinking fountains were segregated, where there was drinking fountains for white people and drinking fountains for colored people, as the sign says. All right. Southern states sidestepped the 15th Amendment, and the guarantee for voting by using poll taxes. You had to pay a tax in order to vote. You had to have own so much land in order to vote. Or they used a literacy test, all right? And especially that one, all of those hurt because the former slaves didn't own property. They probably didn't have the money to pay the poll taxes, and they weren't allowed to learn how to read and write while they were slaves, so most of the former slaves couldn't read or write, so they couldn't pass a literacy test. There's from the time period, reminder to pay your poll tax. Be ready to vote, pay your poll tax before January 31st. You could, as you know, apply for an exemption. That's where the grandfather clause came in. You might be able to avoid the poll tax if your grandfather had voted, and that left out the former slaves because none of their grandfathers had voted. All right, there's the poll tax, $1 for the year 1918. And you're like, $1? Well, back then, $1 was a lot. Okay. And there's a few questions from an Alabama literacy test in 1965, and they're not exactly easy. Which of the following is a right guaranteed by the Bill of Rights? Should be able to get that. The federal census of population is taken every 5 years. Should be able to know that one. If a person is indicted for a crime, name 2 rights which he has. Starting to push it a little bit. A U.S. Senator elected at the general election in November takes office the following year on what date? That's a little bit harder. And a president elected at the general election in November takes office the following year on what date? And there are a lot of people who can't answer 4 and 5.